Yeah, I'm Rick Mullaney. I'm the director of the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University. I was very privileged to serve as legal counsel to three mayors, Mayor Ed Austin, Mayor John Delaney, and Mayor John Payton. I served as general counsel for just over 12 years. I also served as chief of staff during the Delaney administration for a couple years.
And you're not old enough to have been involved in the creation of this thing called consolidation, but you've become kind of an expert on it.
Well, certainly as general counsel for the city, as John Delaney once called the Supreme Court for the consolidated government, Ed Austin called the glue that holds consolidated government together. I'm privileged to serve as the longest serving general counsel of the city, and in that job, consolidated government was really my business. It was the business of the general counsel's office to provide supporting legal services to help make consolidated government work. So I became a bit of a student of it and an unabashed supporter and fan of it during my years because I believe it's such a good form of local government.
So it was officially created in 1967 at the ballot box, but there's an important historical note that wouldn't have been possible if something much earlier hadn't happened.
There's an important part of our history that I'd really like all of Jacksonville to know, and that is what happened in 1934. In the 1930s, Jacksonville had the first of what would be three waves of public corruption. The two would come in the 60s and the 80s. But in the 30s, we had our first wave of it. And as a result of that, some civic-minded people from Jacksonville, led by Daughtry Towers and others, went to Tallahassee, and we amended the 1885 Florida Constitution to put a provision in it that related just to Jacksonville. That is called the 1934 Jacksonville Constitutional Amendment, the JCA. That constitutional amendment provided the constitutional basis for consolidated government. I think it's important that the people of Jacksonville know that our great community leaders, and this change took place in 1934, that there was an amendment to the Florida Constitution relating just to Jacksonville that gave us extraordinary home rule authority and extraordinary authority and discretion to completely revamp our local government in any way we saw fit. Now, it didn't happen in the 1930s for lots of reasons. I've often stated that absent crisis and statesmanship, you're not going to get consolidated government. But that structural piece remained in place so that the people of Jacksonville could take advantage of it 3 decades later.
So it was there and not used for 30 some odd years.
That's right.
But then it made what happened in the 60s possible.
It really did. In the 1960s, I've teased that we were blessed with a crisis, and sometimes your darkest hour can be a turning point that turns into your finest hour. In the 1960s, we had profound crisis. We had city council members being indicted. We had other indictments being issued. We had sewage being dumped in the river. The schools were disaccredited. Civic-minded people came forward and said, remember that 1934 amendment to the Constitution? Jacksonville has the constitutional authority to create a new charter, a new government, unlike anywhere else in the state of Florida, really unlike anywhere else in the country. And we can do it in a way as stewards to create a better future. So they came together and created a charter, which is our local constitution, and it was unlike anything in the state of Florida. This would become the most significant local government restructuring in the history of Florida, and it remains that today. And it is one of the most significant local government restructurings in the history of the United States. It was put together in the 1960s, and as you mentioned, it was voted upon in August of 1967, going into effect on October 1st, 1968.
So you've had a lot of opportunity to see consolidation in action.
I have.
What do you think? Are there changes that you would have liked to have seen or still like to see?
Well, let me say this on consolidated government over the last half century, and I'll borrow from some people I respect so much, and particularly Ed Austin, a former mayor and a former mentor. He would talk about it, John Delaney would talk about it, Hans Tanzer would talk about it. Ed Austin called it what he considered to be the best form of local government in the state. He called it the best in the country. And he and I traveled one time to Escambia County for potentially to consolidate Escambia County and Pensacola. And he said at that time, there are lots of advantages to consolidated government. People talk about lower taxation, accountability, lots on the list. But he said, let me mention one. He said, and so I've borrowed this from him since he's passed away. He said, it gives Jacksonville clout. And what he meant is that the restructuring of Jacksonville, which consolidation was the biggest piece, but we also had a strong mayor form of government as part of that restructuring. We changed how we did legal services as part of that restructuring. We changed how we did independent authorities as part of that restructuring. He said Jacksonville, because of its strong mayor, because of its consolidated government, had the opportunity through that leadership to develop community consensus and to advocate and to have public and private support for policy objectives that could transform Jacksonville. And that, he said, was the basis for how we got the NFL here. That would become the basis for how John Payton would pass the Jacksonville Journey. That's how Mayor Curry would do pension reform. That's how John Mullaney would do the Better Jacksonville Plan and the Preservation Project. So I believe this structure of government puts strong mayors with this government in a position to do some extraordinary things. And over the last half century, we've seen many of them. And I think this structure of government positions us for it. Maybe the most exciting thing is what's possible in our future.
So speculate, if you can, on what Jacksonville would be like without consolidation.
I think without consolidation, we would run into the problem that you've seen in the rest of the state, in which you have multiple municipalities and a county government often at odds over their vision for the local government and their vision for the area. They conflict on economic development. They conflict on taxation. I think John Mullaney would have had a hard time passing the Better Jacksonville Plan. Municipalities would be asking, what are we getting out of this plan? And we don't want our taxes raised. The NFL would have been divisive because different leadership. You've seen around the rest of the state, go to Miami-Dade, go to West Palm, go to Palm Beach, multiple municipalities. In Miami-Dade, for example, over 30 municipalities, 2.6 million people, with 35 police departments, 35 public works departments, very hard to develop a community consensus about the future. In my opinion, if we had not had consolidated government, we would have been a community that would not have been able to move forward on so many different fronts. Clearly, people can look at Jacksonville today and say we have a long way to go. That's true. But if you look back at the 1960s, when I was growing up in Jacksonville, I was 13 at the time we consolidated. In the 1960s, we were a slow-moving southern town with an inferiority complex. And as Ed Austin would say, insert the word smelly. We were a smelly, slow-moving southern town with an inferiority complex. That's how the rest of the state viewed us, and unfortunately, that's really how we viewed ourselves. Consolidation allowed Jacksonville to change not only how the rest of the state and the country viewed us, it began to help us change how we viewed ourselves. And that led to the NFL. That led to the Preservation Project. That led to the Better Jacksonville Plan. That led to a lot of great things over the last half century, and I'm hopeful of even better things in the future.
And I guess we would look back and be grateful that we didn't have so many incorporated municipalities like Miami-Dade and so forth. And the compromise that allowed the beaches in Baldwin to continue to exist, do you think that has worked out?
It has worked out, and let's face it, in public policy, you're always going to make compromises for the sake of a bigger objective. And you had 4 municipalities, Atlantic, Neptune, and Jacksonville Beach, and Baldwin, that got to vote twice, one on consolidation itself and one on retaining their municipal status. They voted in favor of both, and it's worked well. It's worked well. If you look around the rest of the state, other counties have more municipalities. Orange County, where Orlando is, has 13.
And those towns seem to be happy with the
I think so.
compromise?
I think. Oh, you mean here in Jacksonville?
Yeah.
I think so. We have interlocal agreements. As general counsel, I dealt with these. We have interlocal agreements with the beaches communities in Baldwin. The city of Jacksonville acts as a county government to those municipalities, and I think it's worked well. We can have a discussion. Some people might think it would have been better, quite frankly, if it was a purer form of consolidated government. But on balance, I think most people will tell you over the last half century, this has actually worked very well.
And the reason more places haven't done it, maybe they didn't have the right combination of problems and so forth that happened in Jacksonville.
You know, it's interesting. I've been invited around the country to talk about the Jacksonville story in our consolidated government. I've spoken in New York and Tennessee and Virginia and North Carolina. And inevitably, they talk about how do we make this happen. And I caution them that absent crisis and absent statesmanship, it's unlikely to happen because it is such a big change that there is built-in opposition to it, whether it's good or bad. And by that I mean, typically the public employees are opposed because they think they're going to lose their jobs because they'll be downsizing. Developers and others who are doing well with the status quo don't want to change. Those people who feel their economic interests are being well served by the status quo don't want to change. And it appears risky to some. Therefore, whenever other communities around the country consider this change, there is inherent built-in opposition, as there was in Jacksonville, inherent built-in opposition. The difference in Jacksonville is that the crisis was so profound. the disaccreditation of schools, the sewage going into the river, the indictment of local officials, the racial tensions, that people felt we had to show leadership and do something dramatic and structural. Jacksonville's change was structural. It was not cosmetic. We adopted a form of government, as I said earlier, the most significant local government restructuring in the history of the state of Florida. And what gets the most attention is consolidation, because it is the signature piece. And that is the abolition of the county government, the abolition of the city government, and the creation of a unified government with countywide jurisdiction. But the restructuring also included a strong mayor, and that was an important and critical change. That does not exist typically around the state of Florida. Only 3 counties of 67 have a strong mayor form of government. Over the 400 municipalities in Florida, over 90% have a weak mayor, where the mayor serves on the city council. Jacksonville in 1968 adopted the Madisonian federal model, with an executive branch and a strong mayor who has a veto authority, presents a budget, appoints department heads. That mayor would become accountable, and combined with a consolidated government, that mayor's position creates opportunities for leadership in Jacksonville that are unlike the rest of the state. We also restructured how we deliver legal services in the general counsel's office, and how the JEA and the seaport and the airports and those independent authorities would be a part of consolidated government. It was fundamental, it was structural, this was not cosmetic. This fundamental restructuring transformed our local government into something unlike anywhere else in the state, and quite frankly, anywhere else in the country. I believe it gives us a competitive structural advantage over the other 66 counties in the state of Florida. And the good news is not that we've had some great things happen over the last half century. I believe we have. We have a long ways to go. But the good news is it creates tremendous opportunities for the future. If Jacksonville can think it, we can do it with this form of government.
What if any changes would you advocate in the structure of the government?
Well, I think part of this government's, this structure's greatest strength is also a potential weakness. This is a more centralized form of government than other local governments, because when you have multiple municipalities, those municipalities tend to be closer to the neighborhoods. And in that centralization, we have to make sure that we are sensitive to neighborhoods. And we have to make sure that we're sensitive to communities within those neighborhoods. Some people argue, for example, that there's not a built-in structural advocate for downtown. I believe, however, that with a strong mayor and consolidated government, not only can a strong mayor help transform downtown, I think we can create, through community groups, CPACs, and others, that sort of responsiveness to local neighborhoods that's so important. So I think one of the challenges for Jacksonville in the future is to make sure that we are responsive to local neighborhoods. And of course, that we begin and fulfill those promises of investment in critical infrastructure countywide, because consolidated government is countywide, and that investment should be countywide.
Any other thoughts that you would like to add?
No, I think, Harry, you've covered it. I hope I've covered it reasonably well.
Yeah, you know, there was a task force that a few years ago took an in-depth look at consolidation and made some recommendations. And I've heard some people say that perhaps we've had some deconsolidation. It's not as consolidated as the original concept was and as we started out in the late 60s. Your thoughts?
Well, you know, when people step back and look at the structure, over the years, there have been a number of thoughts of how it might be even better. For example, some believe that 19 city council members is a large number. It is a large number. When Nashville consolidated a few years ahead of us, they had 40 city council members. That's an even larger number. In an ideal world, you might want a smaller number of city council members, but it does serve a purpose. And you have 5 at-large districts, and you have 14 districts. So although large and cumbersome, maybe better smaller, it's worked reasonably well. Others have advocated for an appointed constitutional officers, particularly for those who might appear to be more ministerial, such as the supervisor of elections or the tax collector's office. You can have that debate, and I think you could maybe improve it on the margins, but in the end, I believe it's worked well. Others begin to talk about sort of that deconsolidation issue. But the good news on this 50th anniversary, I think, is that the fundamentals of consolidation over the first half century, I believe, have worked well. Not perfectly, but very well. And they've taken us to a better place than we would have been without it. And what is really exciting, I think, is what's possible for the future.